Before we could start on the painting of the body, we firstly needed to clean it up and remove a couple of parts before we could do so. All the mold lines were marked off with a permanent marker to show me where they are and act as a sort of guide code for when I am removing them. So when I start sanding them off, I can see the black line disappear and also still see if there is some of the black line left. That means that the mold line is still there, and once it's all gone, so should the mold line be as well. I'm going to be removing all the mold lines firstly with a rough sanding stick, about 320 grit, and then I will be smoothing that out with some sanding sponges, 600 grit from Tamiya. With the mold lines now roughly removed, I firstly moved on to scribing out all of the panel lines. They were already nice and deep, but just to be sure, I'm always making them a bit deeper and a tiny bit wider, so a bit more paint can flow in them without having them disappear in total. So I take out the engraver from Tamiya. I have links in the description down below to various tools that I'm using, and then just scribing them out and making them a bit deeper. With that all done, I take out the 600 grit sanding sponge and start smoothing out all the rougher edges I left from sanding out all those mold lines, and also give the rest of the body a bit of a sand to give it a nice key for the primer to be applied to. I apply the final side skirts, just glue them in place, then put it on a Tamiya spray stand and move on to the primer stage. I firstly just blow over it with some air to remove all of the loose and remaining dust, then start on those hard to reach and easy to forget spots first, and move on to the main body itself with a couple light coats of primer. So as you can see, the red plastic is quite a vibrant color and it's still showing through that first coat of primer. I let it sit and dry for about 10 minutes, leaving the primer in the airbrush and then later moving on to the second coat, a bit heavier than the first but still wanting to stay light, applying it in pretty much the same way I did the first, then letting it sit and dry for another 10 minutes and applying a third and final coat, because as you can see right here, the red still shows through a little bit and I want to cover it a bit more before I start moving on to sanding it smooth and applying the color. Third and final coat of primer has now been applied, and I then set it aside for about 45 minutes to dry off before sanding it smooth with some 3000 grit sanding sponges. The reason I'm sanding it is to make the primer as smooth as can be, so the color can lay down as smooth as can be as well, as I cannot sand the color coats, so any corrections afterwards would probably mean a repaint. So if you start with a smooth surface at first, the rest of the surfaces that you apply on top of it will also continue to be as smooth as they can without needing any sanding. As I explained, you can't sand those, so that makes your life a lot easier and the finish in the end a lot better. So again, I took out the color, filled up the airbrush, and started on those hard to reach, easy to forget spots before moving on to the rest of the body. With the body of this kit being molded in a vibrant red, I decided to give it a bit more dry time in between coats to give the chemical reactions a bit more time and not go too aggressive, as this paint can be a bit aggressive to the plastic itself. So with a bit more time, I'm just letting it cool down a bit more in between coats before moving on to the next, so that I don't have any of that red bleed through. With this being brown, it wouldn't probably be that visible, and with any other color like white, yellow, or any similar bright colors, you would probably have bleed through. So I'm better safe than sorry, and therefore decided to give it a bit more time in between the coats to dry up. After finishing the third and final color coat, it was nicely covered and I could move on to applying a couple of 3D emblems from Hobby Design. I don't have links in the description as I can't find them on Amazon, and eBay links will disappear too quickly, but if you just do a search on eBay for 3D Ferrari emblems from Hobby Design, or just ask your local dealer or your internet web shop that sells Hobby Design, they should be able to provide you with some. So those were applied, sticked onto them in the correct positions, and I could then move on to clear coating the entire body. So firstly, I just went over it again with some air to remove any of the loose and remaining dust, then mixed up the clear, started on the hard to reach easy to forget spots, and laid a fine coat down on the rest of the body for a first layer. As you can see, after the first coat was applied, it's already nice and glossy, so I set it aside for about 5 minutes to dry in between, then moved on to a second coat, applying it nice and thick just like the first to get it even glossier. So I was pretty happy with the amount of gloss I had after the first and second coat. I still wanted to check it over just to be sure that I didn't really miss any spots, and of course I found some. So while the second coat was still really wet, I applied a little extra on a couple of those spots to smooth it out and even it out with the rest of the clear in order to get the proper finish that I desire.